So you, the learner, you're probably swimming in information, right? Trying to find the key stuff.
Absolutely. There's just so much out there.
And you want those crucial insights, like distilled down, delivered fast. Well, that's what we do here on the deep dive.
We take those sources you give us and pull out the really important bits.
Exactly. Today we're jumping into this discussion called 06 relationship era, basically establishing the concept of relationship.
Sounds fundamental.
It is. Think of it as figuring out the best way to, connect the dots in all your data.
Right. Because just saying things are linked, well, that's not enough, is it? This source gets into the thinking behind it. Why these connections?
And the goal here is that by the end, you'll have a clearer handle on dealing with those complex data structures, avoiding the usual pitfalls.
Yeah, hopefully preventing that feeling of being overwhelmed by data chaos.
And to help us unpack all this, we've got our expert speaker here.
Happy to be diving in.
Okay, so our mission really is to get the fundamental principles for setting up these relationships between data bits.
Moving beyond just surface connections to find the truly meaningful, accurate links, the strong foundation.
Right. Okay, let's get into it. The source, it kicks off with what seems like a simple question. How do you classify education types?
Yeah. Like you've got a curriculum, subjects,
Yeah.
but then within those, you have beginner, intermediate, advanced courses. How do you model that?
It immediately throws up this debate, doesn't it? The source highlights it. Are these levels just simple codes, labels you stick on a course?
Or should you treat them as distinct things, like entities in their own right?
You could just have a field, level with BIA. Seems easy.
But then the source brings in this really vital concept, the key entity.
The fundamental building block, the core.
Exactly. And the principle is focus on that core structure first, the sell it to meet, basically, especially in that initial modeling phase.
It really warns against making things too complicated too early on.
Yeah, it's like sketching the basic outline of a house before you start drawing in every single window frame and flower box. You can lose the big picture.
Right, get lost in the details.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to this idea of, well, maybe delaying some decisions, like how exactly to represent those levels, codes, or separate entities.
The source suggests pushing that to the detailed modeling stage or the normalization stage, later refinements.
So even if advanced level could be its own thing, it might not be a key entity right at the start.
That's a really key insight for you, the learner. Resist trying to model every tiny detail up front. Get the foundations solid first.
Yeah, those finer points, like the levels, you can figure them out later without messing up the core structure.
So a question for you to think about. When you start organizing data, are you really focused on the absolute must-haves? Or getting tangled in details better left for later?
Good question. Okay, so then the discussion moves to dependency. This sounds critical for setting up relationships properly.
Oh, absolutely critical. Dependency helps figure out where information, logically belongs.
How so?
Well, the source uses this example. A subject, I think the source says, Garrett, he probably means subject and its established courses.
Okay, subject and courses.
So imagine a subject like advanced quantum mechanics. By its very name, its nature, it's always advanced, right? The level is part of the subject itself.
Built in. Got it.
But then maybe you have intro to pottery? That subject could have courses offered at different times, maybe a beginner one in the fall, an intermediate one in the spring?
So the level isn't tied to the subject itself, but to the specific course offering.
Precisely. The dependency tells you where the classification belongs. Case 1, level depends on the subject. Case 2, level depends on the specific course instance.
So you really have to dig deeper than just the names.
Exactly. You need to understand what truly governs that piece of information, that attribute. That dependency dictates the best, most logical place to store it, prevents headaches later.
The source uses words like meticulousness and thoroughness. Well, you can't just guess.
No, you really have to analyze the underlying data, how it actually behaves. It requires that careful thought. What's your take on this dependency idea?
It makes total sense. You have to ask, is this a core part of the main thing, or does it change depending on something more specific?
Okay, so we talked about not overcomplicating with code-like things early on. But what if those codes do become important?
Right. This is a neat distinction. The source uses an analogy of facilities,
Right.
pumps, pipes, their components.
Okay.
If we say pump is a key entity, a main thing, should we immediately pull out, say, pump type as its own separate entity,
Yeah.
like different codes for different types.
It's that same question again, isn't it? Separate entity for pump type now, or just treat it as a characteristic of the pump for the time being?
And the source again says, be careful. Don't separate it prematurely unless you really need to. It can add complexity you don't need yet. So the rule of thumb seems to be, does this code thing have its own characteristics you need to track? Or is it crucial for enabling something else?
If yes, then maybe it's its own entity. Otherwise, probably just an attribute for now.
The key seems to be whether it acts as a parent entity.
Exactly. In the pump example, does a specific pump depend on its type classification for its existence? Probably not. It's still a pump, type known or not.
So facility type isn't really apparent in that initial stage. The pump doesn't rely on the type being defined first.
Right. But then the discussion flips to where these code-like things do become essential parents.
Okay, tell us about that.
This is where it gets, well, really quite interesting. The source brings up a scenario with a process control parameter table. Worsley, think of it as a place to manage settings like temperature, humidity, pressure.
Like settings for factory equipment.
Exactly. But instead of tying those settings to every single individual machine, imagine you have different types of machines. Type A ovens, type B mixers.
And maybe all type A ovens use the same temperature range.
Precisely. In this situation, the equipment type becomes a parent entity. Why? Because it enables the whole system of managing those control parameters.
So?
Well, without defining the equipment type first, how do you know which temperature or humidity settings apply? The parameters are dependent on the type.
I see. The existence and management of the parameters relies on knowing the type.
Yes, it's a powerful point. These seemingly minor code things can actually be critical parents. Overlook them early, and you might not be able to manage other important information effectively later on.
Makes perfect sense. If you didn't identify equipment type as a parent here, you couldn't build that important activity. Oh, you just suggest of managing the control parameters properly.
The source even throws in a memorable analogy. Dismissing a potential parent entity is like dismissing Napoleon's father. Maybe seems insignificant at first, but the consequences.
Okay, point taken. Overlooking connections can have big ripple effects. It stresses identifying if a collection acts as a parent that creates sub-collections. Is it giving rise to something else? Governing its existence?
Right. Now, a big challenge is always getting the stuff out of the users, the people who live with the data. The source mentions they might not always explain these relationships clearly. They can't explain because they don't know everything.
Oh, that's a classic problem. People work with it daily, they know it intuitively, but explaining it for system design, that's tough.
So how do you get at it?
The source brings up a great concept. Roughly, seeing something sparks understanding. Use concrete examples.
Show, don't just tell. Give them something tangible.
Exactly. Instead of abstract questions like, what's the relationship between equipment and parameters? You frame a scenario. Okay, we need to manage control settings for all our ovens and mixers. How do we know which settings go where? And that might trigger them to say, oh, well, it depends on the type of oven.
Precisely. It helps them connect their implicit knowledge to an explicit need.
The source even has that funny anecdote about ordering akiri, the Korean stew. Sometimes describing the benefits hot, comforting, delicious works better than a direct question.
It highlights that modeling takes experience and imagination. You draw on past projects, similar situations, and you guide the users. Suggest possibilities based on patterns.
So you're not just an order taker, you're actively guiding the discovery. Okay, then the talk shifts to tricky terminology. Student, instructor, attendee, looks simple, but...
Oh yeah, classic ambiguity source. The meaning really depends on the context, your viewpoint. If a student attends a lecture, does that make the lecturer a student entity, or is the student just related to the lecture?
Right. The source suggests maybe a broader constituent entity. Someone who can be a student now and instructor later.
Yeah, it's a way to handle evolving roles and avoid duplication. Think about it. If student and instructor are totally separate, what happens when a student graduates and becomes an instructor?
You'd end up with two records for the same person, maybe inconsistencies.
Exactly. The source stresses that entity integration isn't just merging tables. It's about understanding the conceptual meaning, how roles change over time.
And the big goal, again, is simplifying complexity. The skill is making complex work simple.
Poorly defined entities lead to messy, complex programs. Imagine trying to track someone's entire journey if their student and instructor records aren't linked. You'd miss stuff.
Okay, so we've got these key entities identified. Now, connecting them. The source notes that key entities and main entities are usually a smaller fraction compared to uh, action entities, like events, transactions.
That's generally true. But defining those foundational key entities, the structure, while crucial, is also kind of irreversible.
Ah, ah, no going back easily.
Like laying the foundation of a building, get it wrong,
Yeah.
and problems.
Mm-hmm. The analogy used is preparing building materials, defining and refining key entities, is getting your core components ready.
And now we connect them, identifying the relationships or connecting links. And this, apparently, is also pretty complex.
It can be, yeah, because a relationship isn't just A-B, it's also B-A. And then there's the view from the outside, the third party.
Like seeing two people walking down the street. You might assume they're a couple.
Right, the third party assumption. But the actual relationship, romantic, family, colleagues, strangers, sharing a sidewalk, needs proper definition. We need objective methods.
So how do we get objective?
The source proposes a two-sided approach. Look at the relationship from both sides of the entities involved.
Okay, give us an example. The classic one, employee and department. Yeah. The simple version is employees belong to a department.
Seems straightforward.
But it's not the full story. The real insight here is that you must analyze the connection from each entity's perspective. That reveals the true nature of the link.
So not just employee belongs to department, but
1. An employee looks at their departments. 2. A department looks at its employee. 2 views making the whole picture.
and this leads to cardinality. One-to-one, one-to-many.
Exactly. But you figure it out by focusing on one single instance of an entity. How many of the other entity does it relate to?
The source mentions mathematical induction, using one example to prove the rule.
Kind of. It's about taking an arbitrary me, any single instance, and seeing how it connects. And the key is, I am always one. Yeah, you're always starting from one instance.
Okay, let's try it. Employee to department. Start with one employee. How many departments?
Right. And you need evidence. Ask the users, is there even one employee who currently belongs to more than one department?
Gotta be precise. Currently, not their whole history.
Exactly. Lack of clarity kills you here. You might assume many to many based on history, but the current rule might be different.
If you're stuck, the source says, go back to the definition. Goenyoyanya, find the fundamental rule.
So refine the question. An employee's current department. Yeah. Maybe that's a specific example context. Let's assume, for this case, the answer is 1. An employee belongs to only one current department.
Okay, that pins down the one side from the employee's view.
Now flip it. One department, how many employees?
Usually a department has multiple employees, right? So
Yeah.
one to many.
Seems likely. But wait, does the department have to have employees? Must it have at least one?
Good question. How do you find out?
Seek evidence again. Is there even one department that currently has 0 employees?
And use ways you show examples. What about a brand new department just set up for planning? Like new product planning, no staff yet.
Or maybe a legacy department kept for historical reasons, but no one works there now.
Okay, so a department can exist with 0 employees.
Right. This brings in optionality versus mandatory, represented by dashed lines, optional, or solid lines, mandatory in diagrams.
So the link from department to employee might be optional on the employee side. A department can have 0.
Exactly. Whereas the link from employee to department, current, was mandatory and employee must have one.
Like the library and books analogy. A library can have 0 books, optional, but a book in the system must belong to the library, mandatory from book's view.
Or parent-child. A child must have parents, mandatory, but a parent might not have children, optional, depending on how you define parent.
The source talks about maintaining universal validity and preventing information disconnection by making relationships mandatory where logic demands it.
Yeah, optional links can sometimes cause trouble, lead to inconsistencies, make it hard to trace things. This is where modeling gets iterative. Continuous improvement. Yeah.
It's not just taking a snapshot of reality.
Right. Not just being a photographer in a studio. If reality has optionality, does she line? You don't just accept it.
You question it, like an artistic photographer.
Exactly. Yes, I don't
괜찮고 그래셔노. Okay. 이거요 구요. Shibio go you go. You find the optionality and ask, should this really be optional? Can we make this mandatory through process or definition?
So it might involve discussions, maybe even changing how the business operates slightly.
Often, yes. Businesses invent things to ensure mandatory links, like that example. Probationary employees belong to the General Affairs Department, temporarily, just so every employee has a current department. Okay, so after all that digging, we define the relationship. An arbitrary employee must belong to one and only one current department. Kano, Kuro, Yogo, and Jua.
Sanjo, Achana Shongo, Kana Chungoa, mandatory 1.
And a department can have 0 or more employees. Ujo jojo. Ojo jojo. Jogo joko jojo. Grovijo bojo dojo.
Optional many.
Wow. Okay, so defining relationships is definitely not trivial. It's this rigorous, objective, two-sided process.
It really is. It's about guiding decisions towards objectivity, not just discovering what's already there. It requires real discussion and agreement.
Now that's fair. It sounds like a lot, but the good news is you prioritize. Focus this intense analysis on the most critical relationships first.
Like a golfer focusing on the key parts of their swing.
Exactly. Strategic effort pays off.
Okay, so any quick practical tips that came up? Definitely name relationships specifically, not just belongs to. Use is current department of or was previous department of. Be clear.
Avoid vague terms.
Right. And the source mentions notation, like the 1 and M for cardinality, which helps figure out database design later. Different tools look different, but the meaning's the same.
And always analyze from both sides. The one perspective for each entity.
And then there was that third-party perspective. How does that fit?
Right, the outside view.
It's useful for getting an initial feel for the relationship's nature. Seeing people holding hands suggests romance, a sentiment, an initial guess.
But it's not the hard evidence.
Exactly. For the concrete proof, you need the first-party view. What is each person's role? Husband, wife, partner, friend.
So third-party view for a quick sense check. First-party two-sided view for the actual definition. Like police getting initial suspicions before detailed interrogation.
Good analogy. Get the broad picture, then drill down for the facts. And the final definition needs to be clear to everyone.
The source also mentioned relationships based on role, right?
Yeah, the same entity can have different relationships depending on its function, like a department performing a construction project versus the department paying for it.
Same department, different roles, different relationships to the project.
Exactly. Or work role versus general affiliation for an employee and department, different facets.
And the third-party view might help spot these different roles initially, seeing someone as a boss versus seeing them as a team member.
One last thing, tools. Different modeling tools might enforce different levels of detail. Some make you define both sides explicitly, some are looser.
Like different management styles?
Kind of. The caution was, don't just fill in boxes in the tool without thinking. Understand why you're defining it that way.
Right. Avoid superficial data entry. Okay. And visually. The source settled on a notation.
Yeah, going forward. Crow's foot for the many side. A straight line about mandatory, dashed for optional.
So the crow's foot points from the many, like her daughters-in-law, many, towards the one. And the line type on the one side shows if it's mandatory or optional, perhaps optional.
That's the idea. Chosen for readability.
Okay, let's wrap this up. Defining relationships. It's a rigorous, two-sided job. Needs clear definitions, understanding cardinality, optionality. Use that third-party view for initial clues, but the first-party, two-sided analysis is key.
You, the learner, should now have a much richer sense of what goes into making those data connections meaningful and solid.
Definitely. And maybe the final thought for you. Look at the data you work with. Those connections, those relationships, are they really clearly defined, truly robust?
What happens if they're misunderstood? Or just, poorly represented? What could be the downstream consequences?
Definitely something to chew on. Powerful questions. And just a heads up, next time we'll dig even more into the practical side of finding and defining these relationships.
Looking forward to it.
Until then, keep making those connections count.